Good evening. I am Christopher Miller, Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. On behalf of our president, Woody Keon, as well as our board, our staff, and volunteers, I welcome all of you this evening for this outstanding, meaningful conversation that we're about to have. Please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the chat. When at a portion within this evening, we will get to your comments and questions. At this time, I want to offer a little bit of background about this series that we started last year. With the convergence of a health pandemic, social injustice, and unrest, the recognition of systemic racism as a health crisis, we decided in May of 2020 to initiate this national virtual conversation series to tackle uncomfortable contemporary topics related to injustice and inequities. The goal of this meaningful dialogue and experience is to provoke constructive action towards truth, understanding, justice, and equity. Please know we will continue to carry this initiative forward along with other meaningful experiences. To learn more about the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, please visit our website, freedomcenter.org. The NAACP Silent Protest March took place in New York City, New York, on Saturday, July 28, 1917. This protest was a response to violence against African Americans, including race riots and lynchings that occurred across the nation for decades. This was a revolutionary approach of protest and the birth of the modern day protest movement. It's sobering and remarkable that we're continuing to respond to violence against marginalized groups with this same approach more than 100 years later. Last year, between Memorial Day and July 4th, there were protests across the nation. Good friend, colleague, Dr. Hassan Jeffries at The Ohio State University revealed last week that 30 million protesters organized last year. And last year, the year 2020, beholds the largest mass protests in US history, the largest in US history. And now in 2021, we are continuing to fight and contend with racial violence, voter disenfranchisement, and various matters of social justice within our society. To be honest, I'm weary, but the ancestors and forebears of true democracy and justice continue to give me strength, and I hope that it will continue to give you strength to climb the rough side of the mountain. So we will continue to leave our mark as the conductors of the Underground Railroad did many, many years ago. So welcome once again. This evening, I am joined by an outstanding panel of thought leaders. Joining me today, we have Dr. Felicia Bell, who is Director of Public Engagement, Our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past, Smithsonian Institution. We also have Dr. Christina Parenza-Coles, author of American Founders, How People of African Descent Established Freedom in the New World. We also have Dr. Wendy Ellis, Assistant Professor and Director, Center for Community Resilience at George Washington University. And then we also have Mr. Dwayne Moore, soon to be Dr. Dwayne Moore, U.S. Government and African American History teacher in Hamilton, Ohio. It's indeed a pleasure to have all of you here. I kept the introductions brief, and I would like all of you to take 2 minutes just to share out a little bit about your projects and anything of significance to really unpack so people are familiar with who you are. And we will begin with Dr. Bell.
Good evening. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such an honor to be on this esteemed panel, and I'm just so happy to be here this evening. This new project and initiative that I'm working on, as you said, is called Our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past. And so this is a new initiative at the Smithsonian. And so what we hope to do is to convene various audiences for conversations, activities, programs, exhibitions, moments that are constructive and meaningful around race and systemic racism. So we're looking forward to launching that soon. And learning about who's doing the work in communities all over the country and the world, and connecting with them and being a resource for them to help elevate their work and amplify what they are doing. And prior to that, I was director of the Rosa Parks Museum at Troy University in Montgomery, Alabama. And that is located at the site where Mrs. Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. And Dr. Parenza Coves.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center and to all of these wonderful panelists for making this discussion possible. I'm an historian and a writer who has spent many decades trying to understand the history and meaning of race in the Americas. For many years, I taught in the history department at Virginia State University. I taught the African diaspora and the Atlantic world. And last year, I was at the University of Virginia as a lecturer in the American Studies department. And actually, just this past week, I had a piece come out online in a source called Public Books. And the article is called "Pay Attention When They Tell You to Forget." And it is a review essay that centers anti-Black violence, its perpetration, but also resistance to it as the central dynamic of United States history. And I'm dedicated to spreading the information that is contained in my book, American Founders, that you mentioned. American Founders, it acknowledges African descended men and women as the protagonists in the story of freedom in the Americas, starting from 1500 and goes up to 1950. And I'm also working on a second book right now, which is actually based on my 20-year-old dissertation called Imagining Communities in Black and White. And that is a study of whiteness and white supremacy in a transnational, transhistorical context, taking a cue from W.B. Du Bois, who observed in the early 1900s that whiteness is a specifically modern historical and political construct. So to kind of rephrase Dr. Du Bois, I would say that whiteness and white supremacy has long been and continues to be the problem of the 21st century.
Thank you. And Dr. Ellis.
Well, good evening. Yes, my work at the Center for Community Resilience is really based on more than 20 years of research and community activism that is focused on leveraging the science of adverse childhood experiences, but with the voice of community, understanding the experience of racism as the central trauma of our communities of color and the intentionality of policy to drive those traumas. And so looking at how we take that intentionality, really getting to the source of the traumas, not just reprogramming or shifting the pieces around in community, but really going upstream, way upstream, to look at the foundational policies, the intentionality of driving these traumas over and over and over again through the course of history. And I appreciate Christina bringing up the point around white supremacy, because we are very explicit when we work with community to understand white supremacy, not so much about what we saw in Charlottesville about individuals and with tiki torches and white robes, but the white supremacy belief that has really been institutionalized as structural racism in all of our policies and practices. And that focus on dismantling that infrastructure from that point of view is really at the heart of our work. So I'm less concerned about individuals who might be burning crosses. While that is a form of trauma, our work is really more focused on dismantling the systems that actually give them power.
Thank you. And Mr. Moore.
My name is Dwayne Moore. I am a 20-year high school social studies teacher at Hamilton, Ohio. Hamilton High School, where I grew up, and I've returned to my alma mater to really expand one of the few African American history programs at the high school level that exists in the state. And beyond that, I am in my third year of my PhD program in educational leadership. Um, I'll be spending the next couple years really expanding my view of education more broadly, so that on the other side of that work, I can speak to the field of education more broadly. Further, very much like Christina said, I've spent a lot of time working on how at a high school level, one frames and properly teaches Black history as acts of resistance. And in order to do that, I've been working on developing an institutionalized, process-oriented way of instructing high school history, so that it is understood simply as narrative, but more so as process, because process is the only thing that offers proper context to understand this really dynamic time that young people are coming of age in. And so this, as well as engaging diversity work both inside the educational structure and in the community more broadly, are the things that I spend my time on these days.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to have all of you to participate in our discussion this evening. For those that may have joined us a little bit late, please know that we will entertain questions and comments in the chat at a certain time. And so please feel free to post those accordingly. And so, one of the things we want to do is really unmask the myths and the realities of America. And there's this continuum of racial hatred that repeats itself. It may go dormant for a certain amount of time. And so we're able to do this program also in partnership with the Cincinnati Regional Coalition Against Hate, where the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center is an organizing partner of this coalition. It's an alliance of organizations committed to being vigilant against hate activity and supporting impacted communities and fostering acceptance, compassion, and justice for all within the greater Cincinnati region. So there's this continuous legacy of racial violence in America, and the killings that occurred in Atlanta a few weeks back is yet another incident of the most egregious social behavior of racism. And so, Mr. Moore, can you unmask your thoughts about the incident and how it has been addressed in the media? And I would like the panel, if anyone else feels compelled to respond to that question, you're more than able to do that as well.
Well, I guess the first thing is the importance of the fact that it hasn't been easily silenced. And if we want to understand progress, and I don't get overly fixated on a narrative of progress, I think that is often dangerous because it allows us to be blinded by easily showy things. But the fact that it hasn't been able to be silenced, to be simply looked over, I do think is important and represents a significant change in our current moment, in the zeitgeist of America in 2020 and 2021. I think it's really critical to speak to it, and when dealing with young people, offer them the opportunity to speak to it. Because one of the things when you're teaching, and good pedagogy, is that you have to meet somebody where they are to get them towards the place that you want them to go. And you can't do that until you know where they're at. And so it's important to let them speak. Following that, then it's about understanding stuff. Understanding stuff, it to me is about giving people sufficient information. And so when you look at the incident, you talk about what, people want to go right to the psychology of the individual. And the problem in the rhetoric of a lot of politics in America and the way that people explain things because of those narratives is that we are deeply interested in the behaviors of an individual. We are not deeply interested in the large scale activities of the nation historically. And so we want to try to understand that moment through just the individual, instead of really trying to understand those moments as what are the things that have happened historically to get us to him feeling like it's okay to go do this. And those are the places where I try to help students connect dots. And the difference between people is how many dots you have. I mean, honestly, people connect dots. But if you ever played with a connected dots thing as a kid, you know the fewer dots you have, the less interesting your picture is. And so you have to give people information. And so when I look at that incident, it becomes about what's going on locally in around Georgia. We have a heightened political atmosphere in Georgia right now that is going to cause a general raising of the atmosphere there, and then you have the things that spout off of that. And these are the kinds of conversations that I have with students in class when either when I broach it, which I will broach things, or if they bring me a question. And to me, it's trying to understand the context of that particularly violent act. But then I start talking about the ways that whiteness is being constructed amongst Asian Americans throughout the 20th century. We talk about court cases from the 1920s following the Chinese Exclusion Act, where people have sued all the way to the Supreme Court to try to get counted as being white. We talk about the nature of cycles of Asian violence against the anti-Asian violence and angst in American life, whether we're talking about sundown towns in out west, or we're talking about immigration in the east, and then I try to help bring understanding through those different lenses. And so we have to realize it's a multifaceted approach to understand that incident.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wanted to respond to that particular question?
I do think that, what Mr. Moore is raising up is this collective ignorance for an entire nation of our true history. And it's been deliberately so, whether it's been whitewashed or whether it's been completely erased from dialogue. And, this is the importance of the truth and reconciliation work that we are piloting right there in Cincinnati, is that we can't get to understanding that which we must dismantle if you do not understand the infrastructure itself. And so, even in teaching structural racism from an academic point of view with my students, I help them to understand that you have to, it's like using the analogy of a house. It is not enough to focus on what is happening in 2021 or policies that were passed in 1980 that have led to mass incarceration today, if you are not looking at the fundamental pillars upon which all of these policies have been built upon layer. So it's almost like being an archaeologist. An archaeologist does not make a decision about or a summary about a society by looking at the topsoil. You keep going down in the layers to really get a fundamental understanding of not only what it is that we see today, but how did we get here? What have we built upon? And so understanding that, when you look at our founding fathers, our founding documents, that laid the plan for all of the policies and the inequities that we see today. Looking at the 13th Amendment and the big gaping loophole that was in there that on its face looked as if it abolished slavery, but it left a loophole there that immediately was capitalized on so that we did banish slavery, except in the case of an individual who has been prosecuted of a crime. And what did that lead to? That led to the Black codes, the vagrancy codes, and once again, we had what many know as the convict leasing system. So you had an Angola prison that went from, a plantation that went from being one of the largest plantations in the state to being the state's first penitentiary. So it is understanding those layers of history. And when, we talk about teaching Black history, it is not just Black people who need to know their history, white people need to know their history too. And so understanding that there is a thing called privilege, but there's also, it was not privilege for all white people. It never was intended as such. But that narrative that has driven divisions, not only between poor white people and other people of color, but also has been used to drive divisions between other people of color in this country, is an important gap that can be filled by the education that comes through the truth. And so understanding, like when I talk about structural racism and how we keep that structure in place, narrative, the facts are the most important thing that are then used to explain why we have an ethnic stratification. That justifies then the class and racial and reinforces the class and racial stratifications. And why is that? For power. So white supremacy, again, as this belief that has influenced all of our policies and practices to do what? To produce white supremacy as an outcome, so that white is the index for everything in this country. That is the truth, and understanding the multiple layers of that has been written and codified to produce inequity by design. And so, Mr. Moore, as you talk about this education, that is the first place that we have to start. We have to understand our collective history, and each of us, regardless of our color, our roles in perpetuating this cycle.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things and that really has put our society in a place to where it is the killing of George Floyd that occurred. And then we turn around at the beginning of the year, and then we have the storming of the Capitol that took place. And once again, I believe that everyone paused in disbelief for a moment, as people saw what was taking place at the United States Capitol. And so there was this conversation that was going back and forth. Is this really America? Is this us? Is this not? And going back and forth, and we kind of unpacked and talked a little bit about, there's always been this strategic agenda of dividing us, either by race, by economics, and whatnot. And so my question is to Dr. Bell, because you've done a lot of work with that Capitol building. Could you share your thoughts about what occurred on January 6th, as well as the aftermath?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. When I was a graduate student at Howard University, my dissertation was about the enslaved labor used to construct the U.S. Capitol building. And while I was in grad school at Howard, I was director of education at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. So I was right there in the middle of all those great resources there at the Library of Congress, National Archives, all that yummy stuff. And so, it was a great time and a great opportunity to be right there in the midst of it. But, when I was sitting in my living room on January 6th, and I saw what was occurring, I was appalled by what I was seeing. I think just shock initially, and then concern for my colleagues who I knew were working in the building. So that was for their safety. So that was my immediate concern. And then just shock that all of that was happened and was allowed to occur. And I couldn't understand it. I guess I just was having difficulty processing it all. And so I mean, literally for the rest of that week, I was kind of out of it, which compelled me to write the opinion piece for the Washington Post on January 18th. And so, you know, what happened that day was as American as apple pie. I mean, because, you know, as the professor Ellis was saying, you know, it is white supremacy as an outcome, you know, and so what has happened is these folks who felt threatened by loss of power, loss of privilege, loss of, entitlement, felt the need to disrupt an essential act of democracy, and that is a transition of power. And so, you know, they knew what they were doing, and I think what to me was so upsetting, of course, was you know, the violence occurring, and of course loss of life, but also just complete disregard for this building that is, I'm a preservationist as well, so buildings are close to my heart, but just this building that's so precious to our national story. And so it is where democracy lives, yet it was built by enslaved people who could not participate in that democracy. And so there are so many, you know, ironies, right? And these people climbing the walls to forcibly enter the building, the very walls that enslaved people built and quarried the stone for weeks at a time in stone quarries in the cold. And as you know, it's difficult to coax stone from the earth in the cold months because the water seeps down between the stone and the earth, forming ice, makes it very difficult work. And you know, those men were given whiskey and other forms of alcohol to help them so-called cope with the labor. And so when I saw them climbing the building, I just was appalled and just outraged. And I didn't think that Black folks or anybody else, I don't think it was common knowledge that people knew about the history and the role of African Americans in the history of the building. And so I felt that they should be as outraged as I was, as I said in the piece. And so this was not new to America, to the story of the country. You know, it had happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, you know, in the late, what was that, Professor, late 1800s. And so this was not something new. And I think, as you said earlier, I think you mentioned about how we have these sort of waves, right? We have these kind of dust ups, you know. It's always there. It's in the DNA of this country. It's not going anywhere. But since it's here, we have to figure out how to live with racism and systemic racism, you know, and we have to figure out how we're going to, you know, get past this white supremacy, these folks who feel they must assert this, what they think is power and privilege. And how can we get to where there is equity, right? Because the moment Black folks and other people of color start to make progress, what happens? The violence is the first thing that happens. They violated the Capitol, okay? It was an act of violence, right? And so how do we also change it so that that is not the first thing that we think of when we want to resolve our issues, is we resort to violence. And so anyway, that's all I can really I guess say at this. It still upsets me. It still makes me it makes me upset still.
There's a couple of things you talked about, so when I opened up, I talked about the 1917 silent protest march.
Yes.
I'm quite sure those individuals wanted to respond with violence because of the violence that was being inflicted upon Black communities throughout the nation. And, Springfield, Illinois, there's this legacy about it. But yet they chose to protest by marching. And so it's amazing to where a friend, the vast majority, of individuals decided to, I guess, to respond with violence versus looking at that. And I do have a question, because you raised something that's very important that I definitely want Dr. Parenza Coles to speak about, but I wanted to make sure if there was anyone that wanted to chime in a little bit about your thoughts about what occurred on January 6th.
Yes, in addition to everything that you described, Dr. Bell, one of the things that I think was on full display is the illness that is white supremacy.
Yes.
And it was when I saw what broke my heart, and I think, Chris was on a meeting with me a couple days later, is what truly stabbed at my heart was seeing that Confederate flag under the Capitol dome.
Yeah.
This is a flag that never breached that Capitol during the Civil War itself, that we had soldiers, brethren of our country, die defending against the sign of a traitorous flag of a nation had broken away from us, that had never penetrated the Capitol building before. And yet these individuals who call themselves patriots wave the flag of both the defeated as well as those who were out and out traitors of this nation, and brought that into that Capitol building. And not to see other white people who have served this country and represented this country's honor across the globe, not have similar outrage, is what really to me spoke to the illness that is white supremacy. Not being able to recognize that we have a deep-seated illness within our family. And so that is the thing that I think is, in addition to the policies that are part of the infrastructure here, what we are talking about is something that is very deep-seated in our culture, that we have to raise up and have these very difficult conversations about how will we extract that which is so deeply embedded in our soil.
And I thank you for reminding me about the Confederate flag in the building. And also, if you look at that photograph, and my goodness, the photojournalists who risked their lives so that we would have the evidence, right? But I remember seeing a portrait of Charles Sumner in the background of that photograph of the man carrying the Confederate flag. And I want to say the other portrait I saw might have been John C. Calhoun or someone else in that photograph. Is that who it was? And just the irony of the moment, and all of this talk of the flag as being heritage and not hate, yet it is always brought up and used in these moments of hate, right? In these moments of violence. So just such a pivotal moment in our nation's history.
And that was what was seen inside the Capitol. Let's not forget the imagery that of violence outside the Capitol when they were setting up for lynchings.
Mhm.
And this is at the same time that we have been fighting in this Congress and in previous Congresses to have an anti-lynching law passed. And yet these lawmakers not only are in the aftermath, not considering any of that legislation, not even acknowledging that we have individuals who, again, call themselves patriots that are using such violent symbolism, whether or not they really thought that they were going to carry out lynchings. The idea was very intentional to raise up these and use these images that over and over again evoke these memories of trauma with the idea that this is all about white supremacy. It was about nothing more than that.
Yeah, and I don't want folks to think that if an anti-lynching law is passed, that means there won't be any more lynchings. Folks don't need, laws to do what they want to do. White Southerners didn't need a loophole in the 13th Amendment to come up with convict leasing system and eventually mass incarceration. So, if the will is there and if the belief system is there in white supremacy, then it will carry on.
Yes, Mr. Moore, I know you want to chime in, and then we're going to go to Dr. Coles. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So first thing is that was happening at the end of my school day while I was teaching my afternoon government class. And my phone was blowing up with friends of mine asking me, are you seeing this? And I wasn't out of school yet. So as soon as they left, I started looking at bits of news. As I was leaving the building, I couldn't get home fast enough so that I could finish, or it wasn't even close to finish at that point, see what was going on. And the first thing that strikes me about that day is that the first thing out my mouth to some folks who I know who are politically conservative, and I'll leave it there, is we know this wouldn't be happening if it was Black folks. And it was the first thing out my mouth. And the way that they recoiled at me saying that truth, because we already had seen what happened in front of that same building when Black people were there in the summer. And so the recoil, the instantaneous refusal to recognize what whiteness does strikes me immediately. Secondly, you better believe my students could not wait to get to my room the next day. And they told me that before they even got to my class, like, I came to school just to hear what you were going to say. And when I talked about it, I talked about that bit. And then I talked about what was really going on and us being aware of the clear racial dynamic. And finally, the pushback that I got from people who, not students, from grown-ups who told me they were there because they were part of my life, because they were pissed with what the government does and how they treat them. I was like, well, then where were these people all through the summer for Black Lives Matter protests? Because the single group with the most well-documented cases of the government not treating them well and fairly are Black people. And where were they then? And that's why I was stunned that it happened, but I wasn't shocked. And to quote Sherilyn Ifill, who is the legal defense fund for the NAACP, her quote is my favorite quote of 2021. Black people have information you need. Black people have information you need. Because if you listen to the thing, because who amongst us was truly surprised that they went that far? Not that you wanted to see it or any of that, but that they went that far. Because like Dr. Jeffrey says, Black people understand what's happening and are sometimes shocked, but never shook.
Thank you. And so I want to build upon the conversation. I think it's critical. Dr. Bell talked about for those that I want to repeat once again, the Capitol was built with enslaved hands. And I think with our education, with our understanding, most Americans, too many Americans, lose sight of how entrenched racism has been, but also not aware of the contributions and the builders of democracy, builders of justice, being the architects of justice, being those of African descent. And so much of what Dr. Parenza Cole's book is about, when I was reading that was coming to light. And I thought about this quote that was given by Joshua Easton in 1837. And I got to give a shout out to Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson, Force and Freedom. It's an excellent book. I'm going to plug her book right quickly. But she shared this quote with us last February before the pandemic. And that quote is this: abolitionists may attack slaveholding, but there is a danger still that the spirit of slavery will survive in the form of prejudice after the system is overturned. Our warfare ought not to be against slavery alone, but against the spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. This abolitionist, this minister, made this comment in this quote in 1837. It's almost as if he predicted that, yes, we're going to dismantle slavery, but something else is going to come about. And someone shared with her, evil doesn't rest, it just waits. And so, but part of that is having an understanding of the role of people of African descent in this country, in the building and the development of this country. And so, Dr. Coles, if you can expound on your perspective of why you committed to writing the book that you wrote, and also share with us your thoughts, about the contributions of people of African descent in the building and development of America.
Yes, thank you. I hope I'll definitely want to speak about African-American men and women as our crucial founders. But if I could touch briefly on this topic of white terrorism that we've been discussing, I just want to pull it back to, going back to a straight line to, white mobs attacked Black and white abolitionists in the antebellum period. In the summer of 1835, there were 35 mob riots started by white mobs alone, right? And we already referenced the 1910s. Everyone here knows about the Red Summer of 1919 when African-American soldiers were returning from service from World War I. There were 25 attacks by white mobs in that summer alone. This is, and then there's a reference, Dr. Bell referenced that, the 1898 coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, where white mobs use violence to take over a legitimately elected interracial government. That our knowledge of that event comes from an African-American historian. I learned this from actually Dr. Greg Carr at Howard in class in Carr, that it was an African-American woman named Dr. Helen Edmonds, who was getting her PhD at Ohio State University, which she was awarded in 1946. She was doing the on-the-ground research, archival research on that coup in the 1940s. Which, to kind of circle around that in my research, I kept finding these sort of hidden stories, if you will, that these are the men and women who have been writing these stories, protecting these stories. But so to get to the American founders story, for me, that begins, the way I was taught American history was that, African Americans stepped onto the stage of US history as plantation slaves in the 19th century and the US South, and then onto the political stage in the 1950s during the Civil Rights Movement. And what I found was, we now know that Africans preceded the English in the Americas by a century. We now know, thanks to excavations in the Dominican Republic, that there were men and women of African descent on the ships of Columbus. We now know that 80 years before Henry Hudson sailed the Hudson River, there was an Afro-Portuguese explorer who was making an expedition there in 1525. We now know that the following year, 1526, that there was an attempt at a permanent colony in what is today Georgia and South Carolina by a Spanish planter, and that the enslaved men and women in Georgia, they mutinied, they rebelled, they ran away, and they joined the Native communities of Georgia 80 years before Jamestown. And we also know that there are baptismal records that there was an Afro-Spanish child born in Florida in 1606, a year before Jamestown was settled and 14 years before the Mayflower landed. But in addition to the fact that men and women of African descent, temporarily preceded and founded the earliest settlements throughout the New World. They helped to build and to defend them. What really fundamentally shifted my understanding of American history is demographic, which is to say that before 1830, 3 times as many Africans arrived in the Americas as Europeans. So after 1830, large numbers of Africans continued to arrive, but this means that up until 1830, most Americans arrived in the New World as slaves. And so what I argue is that, enslaved Americans, while they arrived involuntarily and were denied rights, to say the very least, they and their descendants were Americans who shaped American history at every turn, from the most mundane daily activities to the most watershed events. And this is what American Founders is about. It's about enslaved Americans and free people of color who started independence movements and fought in revolutions and founded businesses and schools and churches and newspapers, who innovated technology and medicine. Men and women who risked their lives and gave their lives fighting for freedom throughout the Americas and throughout American history. We all know that Black men and women have played central roles in the rise of democracy, from the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, all of the wars for independence in Latin America, the American Civil War, the most recent election. And this is often precise, can be because people, a lot of times these individuals were denied rights and justice, so they're on the forefront of struggles for rights and justice, military, political, scholarly, artistic struggles. And so I'm going to wrap up here just with a couple of, back to demographics really quickly, but after the American Revolution, 1 out of 5 Americans, 1 out of 5 people living in the US were enslaved. On the eve of the American Civil War, the majority of Southerners were African Americans. And if you broaden out to the Americas as a whole in the 19th century, the population of African descended people in Buenos Aires was about 1/3 of the population, half of Havana. And in Mexico, Africans outnumbered Europeans until something like 1810. So this is just to say that multiculturalism isn't some invention of the politically correct. It is historically accurate. It's how the area was founded. And I just want to close with a quick example, which is that Black men and women fought in the American Revolution, but not just African Americans. There were Afro-Mexican, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Haitian soldiers fought alongside the patriots for American independence, and that's not including the African American enslaved and free people who joined the patriots by the thousands. So this is to say that we are founded on Pan-American, African descended roots.
Wow, that's fascinating, all of that. I mean, you are on fire with all of that information. You said something that you had me up until you mentioned that people of African descent had been here prior to Jamestown and prior to the Hudson River European explorers, and they are American, is what I think you had said. And I struggle with that because I feel like people of African descent, I don't know if they should be considered American until they get all of the rights of what it means to be an American. So are they, they were enslaved or free during the institution of slavery, and then you had folks freeing themselves, running away, then you have Emancipation Proclamation. Then when the 13th Amendment comes, and the 14th and 15th, I think that is when they start to become quote unquote American. But then you also, they don't have full rights, right? You know, they can't, they say you can vote, but really they got folks, you know, out there violently attacking people so they can't vote. You got Voting Rights Acts, several civil rights acts, right? Beginning in the 66 and so on and so on. Enforcement acts, all these things. So when do we really start? When do we really begin to be American? When can we say, I understand what I think you're saying, that they've been here. You've established that we were here way before these other folks were. I just don't think that's enough to say that we're American. And I don't necessarily think that's the end goal. I don't think that's like the star, the gold star. I'm American now, you know.
I mean, so I have to interject here, because especially if we're going to start talking about what's an American identity, because while I fear that, you know, us in our truth telling here, we are missing one important group here. And it is not a black-white dichotomy about race, and certainly not about defining who is American. And especially if we're going to go back to the 1600s, because the original Americans were the natives, the indigenous people who were here. And actually, it's important for us to raise that up, as when we think about the roots of white supremacy, what happened to the indigenous people here served as a blueprint for everything that came after. And I think we oftentimes do a disservice by not even acknowledging that original sin, that original blood in the soil, because it was those lands that were taken taken by brutal force to create the plantations. And then Africans were able to were brought in to harvest and to till, to fund this growing nation. And it is, the way that I teach this is that it's so important for us to understand the differences in Native Americans, where it was an extermination plan, because they were removed for the land and the resources that land stood on. Africans were brought here for subjugation, for the profits to drive a nation and build a nation. It was not until they were no longer economically of value that you began to see systematic tactics that were very similar to an extermination plan that is built off of the same framework that we had with the treatment of Native Americans. And so when you look at statistically the outcomes that are associated with African Americans in income and education and chronic disease, and you see these parallels with Native Americans, it is the same extermination plan that you saw with the natives and indigenous peoples from the 1400s through the 1600s. It is because we have outlived our economic viability for this country. So let us not be confused about whether it's a black, white, red, yellow dichotomy in this country. It has always been about green, and understanding that is really important for any of these conversations around race, and particularly around white supremacy.
I will say the one thing that I think, you know, about the ideas of who's an American, I take it a step farther, and I look at the humanity, the loss of humanity. Regardless if you see me as an American or not, do you see me as a human being? Do you see me as someone whose life is respected and is dignified? You know, and I think, you know, that is a critical issue. You know, this small layering of my pigment, the melanin that I have, it's amazing how that elevates to a point to where my humanity can be degraded. And so I think, you know, I think that is the larger, issue I see here is the degradation of humanity, and regardless of, of the race. And I think, and I think that's the critical. We have some questions in the chat. I know we've been talking for some time, and I wanted before I open up, and we can kind of look at some of the questions and comments. I'm definitely, Dr. Ellis, you somewhat talked about this, but I wanted to, speaking about humanity, and I think it was raised, the anti-lynching law, which was expressed. I want to know, many of all of us are historians. This journey started back with Ida B. Wells, you know, trying to get this done with, if you're not familiar with the People's Grocery in Nashville, Tennessee, and what happened there. And we talked about, it was a jealousy over a Black grocery store being successful in their business. And these men were lynched. And that was the catalyst for Ida Wells to really to do the work that she's doing. And so when you reflect on the structural violence hiding in plain sight, in the work that you've been doing, when you talk about barriers towards full citizenship, especially of people of color, you talked about policies put in place that were intended to maintain a power structure that maintains a hierarchy of a slave system long after emancipation. Please feel free to unmask your thoughts on these matters and how you see, how can the work you're doing move us forward in a greater appreciation for humanity?
Yeah, I can't imagine what I haven't already said or there's those points. But I mean, I think, as you know, and I'll put our website in the chat for those to learn a little bit more about it. It starts with the truth telling. And much of what we have all discussed tonight is so important for us to understand the history and the intentionality of the policies that have been written, enacted, and enforced with brutality over the course of not just 400 years. We do not drop a pin in 1619. We really do have to go back to the 1400s and really understand the systemic subjugation and extermination of people of colors on this land. But it's not just about teaching the history, it's then also being able to be very laser focused on those policies. And so when in our work, we focus on housing, we focus on public education, criminal justice, and law enforcement, because these are the policies that are most proximal to influencing the community environments that all of us live in. But we know that they're differentially applied based upon who lives there. And so that is where we are putting the pressures on understanding who has access to housing, undoing the effects of redlining, federal policy that held up segregation, the way that we finance our public education system that builds upon having areas of concentrated poverty, which then results in under-resourced public schools. And then that also means that when you have concentrated poverty, we have differential policing, community policing practices. So should not be a surprise that we see different contact rates, different arrest rates, different incarceration rates based upon this gradient of income, this gradient of communities of color. It's all intentional, it's by design, and as you said, it's in plain sight. And so it's being very intentional about understanding not only the separate policies across systems, but how they interact to create this overall system of inequity that is predictable, not only by generations, but down by zip code, down by race, over and over again. It's by design.
Thank you. And so definitely, I want to, there's a lot of history that came out, and I want to definitely, Dr. Prinzico speaking about, I think part of the reason why we don't, and it was mentioned in the chat, part of the reason we don't know this history is part of, that systemic racism and this ideology of white supremacy. Would you say that is the case as well, to why this knowledge about this, about the country, the multicultural aspect in the building of this country is a part of that. Would you agree, or what are your thoughts on that as we will kind of pivot to some of the questions in the chat?
I agree. As I mentioned at the outset, I just published an essay about how anti-Black violence, its perpetration and resistance to it is the central dynamic of American history. We are the only nation in modern history that is founded simultaneously on slavery and democracy, right? Throughout most of the history of the world, people believe that hierarchy was natural, slavery could be justified by prisoners of, enslaving prisoners of war or infidels. And so, and Latin America and other nations, they didn't have a pretext during the colonies that all men were equal. This is the only place in the world that creates this ideology that all men are equal, as it is engaging in the very violent practices of enslavement. And something to point out, I think that we need to really put front and center of the American narrative is that, Americans, everyone knows that at this point recognizes that, Thomas Jefferson, enslaved 6 of his, of his children. Not everyone remembers that Sally Hemings she was the half sister of Martha Jefferson. In other words, and you can see this story again with the Monroes, with the Washingtons, Alexis de Tocqueville mentioned some of this stuff in Democracy in America. This is to say that in the United States, Americans enslaved and were enslaved by their own kin, their own family members. And I think that this has led to a really specific pathology of whiteness that we've been referencing this evening. And I think it really required a lot of cognitive dissonance and real violence to kind of keep that dichotomy in place and to kind of to rationalize and justify a system built on enslavement and a purported democracy. And so I think there was a lot of work that went into rationalizing and changing the narrative. And I think, we've talked about ebbs and flows. I mean, there's obviously, after Reconstruction, it's remarkable how much the narrative gets, rewritten to erase history and to the disinformation campaign that really, I see as kind of growing after the end of, when we stop, and I appreciate your point about what it means to be American, but the way I see it, Americans were enslaving each other, were permitted to enslave each other and their own relatives, up until 1865. And the reason we stopped doing that is because people of African descent, insisted on their freedom through various methods, because of the Underground Railroad, that pushes the Fugitive Slave Act, and that pushes, the Civil War into motion. And why does Lincoln arm formerly enslaved men? Because that's how to win the war. So, and this is a story that you can see over and over again in Latin America and throughout, where people of African descent were on the forefront of these struggles for freedom. And I think there was a lot of whitewashing afterwards to kind of play down and deny this history.
Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to, the idea of, when is that bar passed to when you're recognized as an American. I guess you could make the argument that we still have the level of injustices that are still taking place by people of color. We're still struggling to get to that same level of citizenship, the same level of dignity and humanity as other people, especially when you see certain people of a certain hue commit an egregious act, but yet they're given water, they're taken to a fast food restaurant after committing those acts, and to where you see people of color, for checking the time on their watch or on their phone, guns are drawn. and so that could be an argument that could be made. There are a lot of great comments in the chat. Not particularly, I think some of the questions we kind of touched on that was in the chat. And so we are past the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so what I would want to do at this standpoint is, if there's any final remarks or last words that you would like to leave our guests with, as far as what work can be done, how can we be challenged and inspired to really move towards our greater humanity, to do our role in fighting systems and policies that have kept us from realizing our humanity just because based on race. And I'll start with Mr. Moore, if you could offer some final remarks.
So, as an educator, I, of course, have a distinct bias. I still have this silly idea, perhaps, that we can educate our way out of some of these problems until, to teach certain things until you put yourself out of a job. And so we have to engage in intensive education and very targeted conversation. I mean, the only way, what we're really talking about when we talk about things being covered up is we're arguing over a set of narratives, whether that is in the press with the history that is being written in the moment, or whether we're talking about the things that aren't taught. And frankly, they're not taught because most teachers who teach history don't have any specific body of knowledge they go in with. They go in with some general process, some light pedagogy, and a prescribed set of texts. And those texts have to be interrogated for what they say, and most importantly, for what they do not say. And frankly, because of the comfort of the repetition of the stories we have to be willing to speak to discomfort. And if we're willing to speak to discomfort and elevate the things that fall outside of comfortable narratives of progress, at that point, we can engage in some transformative discussions with each other surrounding a lot of these critical issues. And this is the kind of place and the kind of work and the types of pedagogy that folks like me, and there are more folks like me coming along, and that is comforting to know that folks like me are trying to push those important narratives, those important process understanding and work together, and continue to build and have forums like this where we can make sure that we're not alone in this work. And that is critical. That is perhaps the greatest journey I've discovered over the last few years of my PhD process. I am not alone in this stuff. And so that's really important to know.
Thank you. And Dr. Forensicos?
I think James Baldwin said it best when he observed that white people are trapped in a history that they don't understand. And until they understand it, they can't be released from it.
Powerful. Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Ben?
I was thinking about when you mentioned, Chris, about your humanity and where is the recognition of that. But I think that there is a legacy of dehumanizing Black folks and other people of color. I think I'm seeing that come up, recently in different ways, whether it's a police officer with his knee on someone's neck, or whether that's, there was an issue on that show, The Talk, and the woman, Sharon Osbourne, said to Cheryl Underwood, "Don't you cry. You shouldn't be crying." Well, she said, "I should be crying." But that's an emotion. And so in that moment when she said that she shouldn't be crying, that was dehumanizing her, and it's like echoes of slavery happening, and I'm seeing a lot of dehumanizing behavior happening. And so I hope that we can begin to, recognize folks as, again, there's that equity, and equality, that we're all equal. And so we've got to get around to that and try to take steps to begin to stop this legacy of dehumanizing. It goes way back to Enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson's notes, on the state of Virginia. We could go all the way back, so it's not anything new. So hopefully we can get there.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Ellis?
So I know I've talked a lot about, what I teach, but by no means am I just an academic. We do this work across the country and community, holding these very difficult conversations around racial equity. And one of the things that I've learned is that if we are not making people uncomfortable, we are not doing our jobs. We have to go beyond the status quo. I, as an African-American woman, should feel uncomfortable. I need to go outside of my own limits and not just talk to people who look like me. But I go into rural America and have these conversations about equity, because oftentimes those communities don't even recognize that the policies that were written to create inequity in communities of color are now driving the negative outcomes that they see in their own communities. So using that truth, speaking that truth, and helping to draw some understanding across color lines are absolutely important. One of the things that's really important, and I do believe it's James Baldwin, forgive me if I get it wrong, but the general thought is that America has a promise for democracy, but it's Black people who have continually pushed it to live up to that ideal. And we saw that in January with the election. In fact, just hours before the raiding of the Capitol, the announcement of Reverend Warnock being elected as a senator in Georgia, making history. That was because Black women made that happen. And so we do have a rich history of making America live up to its ideal and live up to its promises. And that is the challenge that is in front of us today. It is, how will we make America live up to its promises and its ideals? But here's the kicker. Black people, as you talked, Dr. Bill, built the buildings and many of the things that have produced this economic engine of America. But Black people and people of color did not build the infrastructure of structural racism. That's on white folks. And so we cannot be expected to dismantle that of which we did not build. And so it cannot just be voices of color that are leading this fight. White folks have to come in from off the margins and be a part of actively dismantling that of which your forefathers built. That is the challenge that is in front of all of us.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all of you for your contributions to this conversation. I want to thank you for your contributions in your respective networks to make a difference. It was placed in the chat, about trying to people listen. And the question is, what else can I do? We have to be persistent, and we must guard our hope at all costs. Brian Stevenson, who I've had the pleasure of meeting on 3 different occasions, he talks about guarding your hope. And sometimes that can be quite challenging when you see the things that are taking place. And so what can you do? Guard your hope and be persistent. As I stated I get weary, I get tired. And I get tired of having these conversations. But I'm also tired of us being in the situations that we are in. So I look to the strength of our forebears and our ancestors and say that I must continue to talk. I must continue to fight. I must continue to make a difference. So for all of you, what can you do? Be persistent, guard your hope, and keep telling and walking the truth as much as possible. Please take the time to visit our website. I placed in the chat, we do have our next virtual discussion that's taking place on April 13th, Modern Day Abolitionism, Mass Incarceration, and Rural Justice. And so this will be, once again, a difficult conversation, but a much needed conversation. Also, please, I would appreciate if you would take the time to take the survey. That link has been placed into the chat as well. Your feedback will be greatly appreciated. So once again, in closing, I want to thank this outstanding panel Please stay connected, National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. We want to stay continued with the wonderful work you are doing, and so that we can convene again for a conversation as we continue to do the work that we are doing. Thank all of you that have participated to join us this evening. This has been recorded. We will share this on our YouTube channel, which you can find all our Unmasking the Realities conversations that we've had as of today. And so thank you once again, and have a safe and blessed evening. Thank you.